It's Ramsey Dewey over here in Shanghai, China. Welcome to another edition of Q&A with the Coach. Before we begin, big shout out to the channel sponsor, NogiBJJGear.com. Go check them out at NogiBJJGear.com. Don't forget to use my code Ramsey10 for 10% off everything. They've got great rash guards, shirts, shorts, and hey, if you like this t-shirt, that's where I got it, NogiBJJGear.com. Now on with the questions. Our first question comes from Ricky Lamb. He's noticed that a lot of videos are popping up with traditional martial artists getting just trounced by middle-of-the-pack MMA athletes in his estimation. He says, this obviously highlights an issue. Well, yes, I suppose it does, which you and many others have remarked upon, but what people rarely speak about is whether there is a solution. Are traditional martial arts doomed to forever be a conceptual thing? How do you fix them? Is it something as simple as adding sparring? If so, why haven't schools adopted it? Well, okay, I see where you're coming from. If you have a conceptual martial arts school, and by that I mean a group of people who get together and they do a lot more of this than exchanging these, then they tend to not know how to fight very well. However, when you contrast that with a combat sport where they are actually practicing to compete against a live resisting human who's fighting back, and not just fighting back, but someone who's actually skilled and trained at fighting who's fighting back, then the skill level at actual fighting diverges by leaps and bounds. The conceptual guys who don't spar and don't train and don't have a very clear objective about where they're going to go with that martial art don't tend to be very good at fighting, and the ones who actually train how to fight do. So what can we do about that? Well, most people don't actually want to spar. Most people don't actually want to fight. We love the idea of fighting. Most of us don't love the reality of it. The reality is harsh, it's brutal, it hurts, it leaves us injured, it causes problems. And most of us, and rightfully so, try to stay as far away from problems and trouble and stress and unnecessary hard work and pain as possible. Not everybody needs to fight. I think everybody should train. Everybody should train to fight, but not everybody needs to compete. Not everybody needs to be a great fighter. The solution isn't so much that the traditional martial artists need to spar, it's that people need to be honest about what they are doing. It's totally fine to be a martial arts hobbyist. It is totally fine to do that. To dress up in a martial arts uniform and go and bow and do your forms and never ever spar or compete or fight, that's totally fine. Just be honest about what it is. The problem comes where you have folks who do that sort of thing and they don't spar and they don't fight, but they think that they do know, or they've been convinced that they know. And then one of several scenarios happens. They either get into a fight and they get trounced and they get hurt, or they perpetuate this cycle of feeding this horrible beast, of deluding people into thinking that they know how to fight when they don't, and then other people get hurt. Or, more often than not, egos get hurt, because most of the fights that these folks get into happen on the internet. They're typing angry words and feelings get hurt, and nobody feels good about that, and everybody gets mad. Boo. Hiss. So what is the solution, my friend? Be honest. If you want to train how to fight, go train to fight. And that does include sparring. Yes, 100%. Absolutely. And if you want to be a conceptual martial artist who delves into theory and gets into arguments on the internet about, well, if you did this, then I would do this, fine. Just be honest about what that is. And please don't get suckered into a fight that you are not equipped to do. Next question. Our next question comes from DA, who says, I don't know if you'll read this. I am reading this. Do you guys know I read the comments? A lot of people are shocked and surprised when I read their comments, and I leave a little heart or like symbol or whatever that's called on your comments, and you're like, oh, this is a real person. He's not just some mindless entity made by the YouTube algorithm who popped up in a screen. He's a real live person who interacts with me like a human. Guess what, guys? I'm a human. Surprise. But DA, he's 16, going on 17. He's training in MMA, but he broke and dislocated his wrist terribly. He's had this serious injury with his wrist from wrestling when he overtrained. He says, I had an operation and it's been really mentally hard because I feel like I'm losing my dream of making it to the UFC. I'm worried my wrist will never be the same. And because I have to take so many months off, my competition will always be way ahead when I've recovered. Do you have any advice? Sorry for such a long comment. All right, you've had an injury, and I'm not going to try to minimize your injury, because that's a serious thing. You kind of need wrists to fight. They're really useful if you want to throw punches. They're really useful if you want to grapple. They're really useful if you want to do all the things that hands and wrists can and should do. And you want every single advantage you can have in a fight. Now, you're 16 going on 17, and I know what that's like. And I get emails almost every day from young guys who have a dream of being a cage fighter or being a kickboxer, and they feel like they have this very, very limited time frame. If I don't do it now, I will never make it. And I'll tell you a couple things about that. Regardless of when you start fighting, not training, but fighting, generally speaking, a professional fighter who has a good run at it, and by that I mean someone who doesn't suffer serious injuries, who has a full fight career, generally has no more than 10 years, if they are lucky, 10 years of full contact fighting. And that doesn't matter if they start fighting full contact as a teenager or if they start fighting full contact at age 30. If you look at those guys from Thailand, for example, they start fighting when they're kids. And they generally stop fighting by the time they're 20, 21. And by that time, they're basically broken. The average age of a UFC fighter is about 29 and a half years old. That's the average age. And that shocks a lot of people because they're like, what, 20? That's almost 30. 30's old. Well, it's old when you're a teenager. When you're 16 years old, that sounds ancient. But that is the average age of a UFC fighter. And if you start a full contact fighting career at age 30, you start taking the hits at age 30. Essentially, what is happening there, as opposed to starting at age 16, and I'm not talking about starting training, once again, starting taking the hits to the head, is that you start accruing brain damage. And that is the major reason why your career would be limited to a maximum of 10 years if you are lucky. Now, going back to that injury. So, again, it's not so important when you start competing, so much as when you stop competing. But going back to your injury again, you've had a serious injury to the wrist. It's set you back. Your peers are still training when you can't, and you feel like this is holding you back. I could throw out many, many, many examples, many anecdotes of great fighters who overcame much greater injuries, who were told by doctors things like, you will never walk again, let alone you'll never fight. Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, if you remember him, he had this weird scar, this big old scar on his back. And I always wondered what that was up until I read one of his books. And in that book, he explained he was in this horrible childhood accident where he was run over by a truck and it crushed his liver and he needed this major surgery. And the doctors told him basically, you are lucky to be alive. You will never play sports. You will never run and play like a normal kid again. You're just lucky to be alive. And what did he do? He went out and became a badass cage fighter. And a great one at that. Now, again, I don't want to minimize your injury or say, that's nothing, suck it up, buttercup. Because it is a serious thing. Every injury is a serious thing. You may never be able to fight the same way. I don't know the extent of the injury. That is a possibility. But here's the great thing. You may never need to fight the same way. So many of the great fighters have a story like this. They get an injury, and so they change their fighting style because of that. Bill Superfoot Wallace is a great example. He changed his stance because he tore his ACL in one leg, and so he put his other leg in the lead to try to protect that injured leg, and ended up doing all these crazy kicking combinations up on one leg and knocked out a bunch of people and won a ton of fights. And he wouldn't have fought like that if it weren't for that injury. He was never the same after that injury. Good for him. Dominic Cruz, another fascinating example. Man, when that dude won his UFC title, he had a laundry list of injuries. 2 torn ACLs. The dude couldn't even walk in the morning because he had plantar fasciitis in both feet. Just a crazy story about these injuries this dude was suffering when he won his title. It's obscene, the amount of struggle he went through. And a lot of people remark on Dominic Cruz and his weird fighting style. Some people try to emulate it. But then you listen to what the man said, and he said, basically, I fought like that because I had to. He's not trying to copy some movement on the internet. He's moving the way that he can, maximizing the way that he can move. So I have faith that your wrist is going to get better. It may set you back a little bit, mostly in time. The body is so incredibly good at compensating and rebuilding over time, if you allow it to. But even if you always have some weird issue going on with your wrist, guess what? You can find a way to work around that. I mean, man, look at Nick Newell. The dude didn't even have most of his arm. One-armed fighter. And he still won the overwhelming majority of his fights, including a world title. Kind of does sound like I'm saying, suck it up, buttercup, but you have the advantage of time and youth on your side. The great thing is you are young. You probably don't feel like it because you feel like you're almost over the hill. You're not. You have time as long as you use that. If your wrist is broken, train another part of your body. There's always another way to train. Next question. Our next question comes from Bill. Bill says, would you be kind enough to answer a boxing question? Sure. Bill goes on to say, I've been told by some trainers that a straight rear hand punch to the middle center point of the chin is as effective as landing on the side of the chin. Others say only the side of the chin for the knockout. Is there a real difference? Well, yes. Yes. There are different ways you can get knocked out. There are different events which are called a knockout in a fight. Now, if you punch the side of the chin hard enough, what happens? That's a lever that whips your head around very quickly and makes your brain smack from one side of your skull to the other, and that can cause a concussion, which can knock you out, cause you to lose equilibrium, even consciousness, fall down, do the fish dance on the floor. if you get hit in the front hard enough, that can drive essentially the base of the jaw down here into the base of the brain and cause some electrical signals to go boop and cause you to essentially fall and start doing the fish dance. It's a different biomechanical process, but you're getting a very similar result. You could also hit somebody in the temple really hard and cause them to lose their equilibrium. Not necessarily lose consciousness, but cause them to lose equilibrium, fall down, not be able to get up under their own power. That could be considered a knockout. You know, I've seen some guys hit so hard on their guard, you know, with their hands up, protecting their face, and get hit so hard on their guard that the shock wave concussed them. You know, you can get hit right here between like the ear and this little point on the jaw and the neck right there, and that can cause a knockout. There are a lot of collisions that can cause somebody to fall down and not be able to get up fast enough with enough of their wits about them for a referee to consider it fair for them to continue, which we call knockouts. But again, the biomechanical process is different, sometimes in a subtle way and sometimes in a major way. But if we want to simplify this as much as possible, you want to knock somebody out, hit them in one of these sweet spots, and there you go. Next question. Our next question comes from Dr. Fistface. I love this screen name so much. Dr. Fistface, that's awesome. Dr. Fistface says, I took martial arts all my life, and every one of my instructors was a jerk. Too bad, man. Even the ones that really tried to be nice had emotional problems that would get them into fights. In fact, most of the students I trained with were mean guys that learned fighting to solve problems. I've spent a ton of time training alone just to be rid of these toxic personalities until I need to progress and go back. Rokas of Martial Arts Journey, shout out to Rokas. Go check out his channel if you haven't. We did a very fascinating podcast together. Maybe I'll link that in the description below. If not, it's linked in my podcast playlist. Anyway, Rokas recently talked about toxic people in traditional martial arts and said that these traits tend to get filtered out in modern styles like BJJ. Do you have any thoughts or experience with being forced to train with bullies and jerks? I wanted your perspective because I have heard so much of your material that I can't imagine you treating people the way my instructors treat their students. Okay, Dr. Fistface. I love your screen name. I don't love your predicament. I feel empathy. I think this is one of the big differences that we can see in traditional martial arts and modern combat sports, sometimes but not always, because you're going to see jerks in every walk of life. But I am curious to know whether or not you've been training in traditional styles or in modern combat sports. I had a student from Russia come and train with me here in Shanghai, and after a couple of weeks, he pulled me aside after class, and he said, with this very heavy, rough Russian accent, broken English, he said, "Coach, you are like an angel." And I was like, "What? What are you talking about?" He's like, "My other coach in Russia, he was so mean, he was so strict, he just beat us up the whole time. He was a big jerk, basically." But you care about whether or not I know how to fight, whether or not I understand these techniques. You were like an angel, he went on to say. And he kept making this comparison. And I thought, well, I get it. I know there are a bunch of jerks out there in the martial arts. There are a lot of combat sports camps where people just beat each other up, and they're a bunch of sadistic jerks. And that's all they want to do is get into gym fights. And there are a lot of coaches out there who are essentially sociopaths, and all they want to do is be the guy in charge and be the big fish in the small pond and have everybody jump when they say jump and everybody bow when they say bow. And they can turn into these stupid little cults. Now, traditional martial arts, I think, is particularly prone to this type of behavior. I've had a bunch of emails from folks describing problems at their traditional martial arts schools because they were cults. They're describing word for word, definition for definition, a cult-like atmosphere where everybody is essentially venerating the coach, venerating the sensei, venerating the grandmaster, whatever it is. And the atmosphere often turns toxic. There was a young woman sent me an email a while back. I'll probably address that one in another episode because there's a lot to unpack in this one. But she told me about her, I think it's a kung fu school, and there's like a clique of senior students who kind of run the whole show, and it's weird, man. It's weird and complicated, but she's describing this very toxic environment. But all she wants to do is learn kung fu, that's it. But it seems that in order to do that, she's got to go through all of this rigmarole first. And I hope you don't live in a place where the martial arts cult is the only show in town. Because worldwide there are many great instructors. There are many great gyms. I mean, just off the top of my head, here in Shanghai alone, fortunately, 12 years ago there was basically nothing here as far as combat sports. And now, today, I could name a dozen coaches in this town that I trust, that I think are fantastic, who are great with people, who have positive environments in their gyms, and there are many great places to train here now. And I don't think Shanghai is this special exception worldwide. I don't think it is. There are also toxic environments here as well, man. I've known a few coaches who were, one in particular who is probably the worst human being I have ever met in my life. Maybe I'll unpack that another day in another video, man. But martial arts tends to attract the best and the worst, tends to get the best and the worst out of humanity, because it reinforces a lot of positive attributes. When we train in physical culture, when we train in matters of self-improvement, we can reach for the stars, figuratively. But because there are elements of competition, not necessarily competitions in your martial art. Take, for example, Aikido. In most sects of Aikido, there is no competition. There's no Aikido tournaments. But there are definitely elements of competition within the hierarchies in those dojos. And I've heard some crazy stories. In fact, speaking of Rokas on Martial Arts Journey, he's got plenty of crazy stories about these elements of competition of the ego in these martial arts hierarchies, in these dojos, in these Aikido schools. So definitely go check that out. He's got a lot of great things to say about that. I had 6 different Taekwondo instructors. I used to be way into Taekwondo. That was my first martial art many years ago. And I had 6 different Taekwondo instructors over the years. And one of them, it seemed like we started out on really respectable terms. Seemed like he was genuinely interested in seeing me improve at Taekwondo. But I remember when he found out that I was cross-training in other martial arts, oh man, it got toxic. Suddenly he was like, Ramsey is not one of us. He's one of them. And he tried to turn the other students against me, and I lost a bunch of my friends. And it was weird. And I was like, dude, I'm just trying to improve myself as a human and as a martial artist, and how is this conflicting? But Man, he wouldn't have any of it. And he was like, we should strip you of your rank and kick you out of here, and all of this nonsense like that. Just because I cross-trained in different martial arts. So if you got a coach who is like that, who, if you look in the direction of another martial arts school, or say, hey coach, I think I want to cross-train in boxing and wrestling as well as doing my Krav Makido at this school. And he's like, no! Run away. Run away as fast as you can. Because chances are it's not the only show in town. And if it is the only show in town, if that's the only gym in town, if it's the only option, it's probably not a very good one. Probably not. Because competition breeds excellence as far as combat sports goes. But again, in traditional martial arts that don't have not the element of competition in hierarchy and egos, but the element of competition in sport, when there are other gyms around there, what happens? The instructors often, because they doubt themselves and they doubt their students and they lack confidence in their own abilities, instead of stepping up their game to be the best gym in town, what do? They play little mind games with their students and try to hypnotize them into mindless little followers who will do whatever they say. And, no, don't participate, don't look at them, stay with me. I don't know what specifically is the type of toxicity that is happening at Dr. Face's school. Maybe it's bullies. Actually, I think it is. I think he did say that explicitly, that it's a bunch of bullies. And yeah, this happens. And I just described a whole bunch of different scenarios. I think it's related, though. Because bullies are generally people who want to be the big fish in the small pond, as I said, and they lack the constructive type of confidence that allows them to take a loss and learn from it. And so they're always looking for an easy fight, if you will. They're looking for that easy victory to help them feel good, to validate themselves as a martial artist. Whether that is a victory in sparring in their mind, or a victory picking on the little guy and asserting their strength and their dominance, it's basically the same in the mind. The easiest advice would be to say, move on, but it sounds like you've moved on and on and on and checked out a lot of different places and run into the same problem again and again and again. Now, if this is the case, if you keep running into the same problem over and over and over again, instead of looking outward, that is a good cue to start looking inward and asking yourself, is there something that I am doing that is creating this toxic environment? Is there something that I am doing that is giving anyone cause to respond to me the way that they are? That might sound like victim blaming, but we want solutions, pragmatic solutions right here, don't we? And blaming everyone else in the world, it's his fault because he's a bully, it's her fault because she's mean, that doesn't help, that doesn't stop it. That just pisses people off. So one of the best things you can do, Dr. Fistface, look into your own heart introspectively and ask some serious questions. Next. Our friend William wants to know, how do Mormons differ from other sects of Christianity? I never looked into it before. A religious question, as opposed to a martial arts question. You guys can ask any types of questions you want in the comments. You might notice this channel is named Ramsey Dewey, as opposed to Ramsey Dewey only ever talks about martial arts and nothing else. Ask me anything, like literally. I'm okay with that. How are Mormons different from other sects of Christianity? Well, there are many, many, many sects of Christianity with many, many differing beliefs and interpretations of the Bible and so on. How are the Mormons different? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the real name. Mormons is a nickname. In case you didn't know, one of the big difference, it's the Book of Mormon. What's that? Well, it's an additional book of Scripture. We use the Bible and we also use the Book of Mormon. What's the Book of Mormon? The Book of Mormon purports to be an ancient record from several groups of ancient people who traveled to the Americas from the Old World, developed a civilization there, had experiences with God, prophets wrote down stuff, and then they had a bunch of wars and they all died. Spoiler alert for the Book of Mormon, everybody dies at the end. Yeah. It's one of those books. How many of those books are there? Huh. Hamlet, everybody dies at the end of that one. This one on a much, much more epic scale. So there's the Book of Mormon, which we believe is another testament of Jesus Christ. And that's probably one of the big ones. That is one of the big ones. That's probably the biggest one. What else do the Mormons believe in? Well, like most Christians, we believe in God the Father, in Jesus Christ, in the Holy Ghost. We believe that they are three distinct beings, one in purpose. And that's way different than the commonly accepted doctrine of the Trinity. That God is, three beings in one, and I don't want to butcher anyone else's belief, so I'll leave it at that. What else? Man, this could be a really, really long answer. So I'll simplify. There is a belief that the heavens are open, as opposed to closed. Many Christian sects believe in a closed canon of Scripture, that there are no more prophets, that God doesn't speak to men anymore. And the Mormons are like, nope, he totally does. The canon of Scripture is open. The heavens are open to revelation, angels, etc. That God is a God of miracles in the modern day. And if you are not seeing them, it is because, one, you're not looking for them. Because faith precedes the miracle. Religion, to me, is an action word. Somebody asked rhetorically in the comment section earlier today something along the lines of, in this day and age, why does anyone believe in religion? And I thought that's a really weird way to express that idea. I know where he's getting at. And that's a great question. Why would anyone believe in religion when religion is not belief? Any more than martial arts is belief. It's action. Because if I say, I believe I know how to fight, but I don't train, and I've never done it before, then I don't know how to fight. And if I say, I believe in Jesus, but I don't actually do the things Jesus taught, then I don't actually have faith in Jesus. It's that simple. And I'm not living the religion of Jesus. So religion to me is an action word. It is what you do. It's how you live your life. So I can point at things like, well, the Mormons believe in the Book of Mormon and prophets and Revelation and all this other stuff that other people don't necessarily believe in or share. But ultimately, my interpretation of Mormonism, if you will, of the quintessential doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints can be found in the Epistle of James in the Bible, where he said, faith without works is dead. One guy might say, hey, show me your faith. And James said, I will show you my faith by my works, because it's an action word. Jesús amigo es verbo, no sustantivo. Do you know that song? It was a song I heard all the time when I lived in Argentina. Jesus, my friend, is a verb, not a noun. And that's kind of way more profound in Spanish than it is in English, because in the Spanish Bible, in the book of John, where it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," the Word in capital letters referring to Jesus Christ. In Spanish it says, "El verbo," the verb, the action word, was with God in the beginning, and the action word was God. And by this action word all things were made, by action, by faith. Because faith, my friends, is an action. So, we could make a really long video about all the ways Mormons are different, but I think it's a lot more constructive to ask ourselves, how are we the same? So I have many friends of many different religions and lacks thereof. I mean, the official religion of China is, there's no religion here. It's not even atheism, because atheism is the antithesis of religion. It's just like, no. Nothing. So, when I speak to my friends who are Muslim, I find we have a lot in common. Like the Muslims, the Mormons, we don't drink alcohol either. We share many of the same beliefs as far as morality, the way that we should live our lives, the way that we should be in our hearts. When I talk to Catholics, sure, we could nitpick about little differences in doctrine, but at the end of the day, what is the most important thing? The being that I worship, Jesus Christ, is the central figure of their religion also. And we can get together on that, and that's a beautiful thing. And when I speak to my Protestant friends, the same thing. The same thing. And when I speak to my Buddhist friends, I've read the teachings of the Buddha, and Buddha had some fascinating ideas, and you know what? They may not believe in Christ, but they believe in many of his teachings. And if you believe in the teachings of Christ, you're not too far off from what I believe either. And so, if the people of this world could find themselves becoming of one heart and one mind, the limits to what we could accomplish would be limitless. A story in the Bible which is repeated in many non-biblical narratives, the story of the Tower of Babel. I love this story because it's so fascinating, and my mind goes in all these crazy directions when I read it. But I love the story of the Tower of Babel. It's found in ancient cultures from Mexico, in Cambodia, in many different cultures across the world with some variations. But in all of these Tower of Babel stories, at one time, all the people speak the same language. And God or the gods get together, and we find this particular verse, I'm going to paraphrase it, in the book of Genesis in the Bible, where the gods get together. Yes, gods plural, it says. And they look at people getting together to build this tower, and we don't know exactly the details of the tower other than they were building this to try to get to heaven by themselves without God's help. And God wasn't very happy about that. And so he decided, I'm going to change their language. And here's why. He said, the people are of one mind, and they speak the same language. And because they're all of the same mind, and because they can all speak the same language, they're all on the same page. The limits to what they are able to do, there is no limit. And so because they're using that power irresponsibly, we're going to cut them off and change their language and divide them. And so we have these divisions. Division of tongues, division of colors, division of cultures, and the stupid and foolish and childish among us allow these meaningless barriers to be barriers. You're a different color than me, and therefore we can't be friends. You speak a different language than me, and therefore you live on that side of the pond, and I'll live on this side of the pond, and we will never ever learn to talk to each other. You have a different cultural background than me, so you can't play on my side. Oh, your religion is different. Yeah, we can't click. No way, Jose. Not gonna happen. How silly is that? The missing ingredient right there is being of the same heart and the same mind, not just with each other, but with God. And we're not going to get there quibbling over, well, my book says this and your book says that. We had a group of people in ancient times reaching for the stars, trying to build this tower of some type to get there. I'd like to think in a science fiction-y way. Maybe it was a space elevator. Maybe it was some sort of transportation device. I don't know. Maybe it was a brick and mortar structure. But regardless of how advanced that technology may or may not have been, the intent of their heart was clear. It was not in the right place. They were of one heart and one mind with each other, but not with God. And so if you want to know the things of God, turn to God. That's my advice to every one of you who considers himself or herself to be religious. Turn to the source for the answers. And make sure that your religion is a religion of action. That you are integral enough with your word that you do what you say and you say what you mean. Because ultimately, as far as the Christian God, the verb, the word, el verbum, the one that spoke words, and it was so. Let there be light, and there was light. Because he was integral enough with his word that every word spoken by the word was the truth. And because it was the truth, because let there be light was the truth, there was light, and it was good. Next question. Our last question comes from an anonymous viewer who says, I've been training for the duration of half of my life, and I've recently decided to start fighting. All right. In your experience, what does it feel like to fight in the cage? What are the mental processes before, during, and afterwards with wins and losses, and how much does it hurt during and after the fight as well? Some perspective could be very eye-opening, not only for me, but for a lot of fighters that watch your channel. Thank you for taking the time to read this. Your work really makes a difference, and I, for one, really appreciate it. Well, I really appreciate you, my friend. Thank you for watching, as always, and I appreciate the positivity. Appreciate the question. Now, like most of the questions that I answer on this channel, the answers to these questions are highly variable. They're going to depend entirely on who you are, how you process anxiety, how you process emotions. But I'll give you my experiences. What does it feel like to fight in the cage? It can feel like a bunch of different things depending on who you're fighting. During the fight is not generally when you process it. It's generally after. At least that was my experience. During the fight, it's chaos. I keep saying you, but I tended to go on autopilot. Most people do. We drop to our lowest form of subconscious direction. And for untrained people, that's flailing and going nuts and grabbing the head and squeezing and doing stupid stuff. For trained fighters, it is the level to which they have instinctualized their training. But generally, fights tend to go on autopilot, and I processed them afterward. So what does it feel like when you're fighting? Feels like chaos. Kind of feels like being an observer, like you're watching the fight happen from a first-person perspective. And sometimes I surprised myself by what I was doing, like, oh, I'm doing this now. Okay, I just smacked that dude with an elbow. Did that really just happen? Okay, it's happening again. Boom. Huh, he's on top and he's beating me. I don't like this. I don't like this at all. Oh, I'm on top and I'm beating him. Woohoo! And everything in between. What were the other questions you asked? What are the mental processes before? Before fights, there can be a ton of anxiety. We tend to create monsters in our imagination. Imaginary monsters that will tear us limb from limb, tear our heart out, rip our heads off, paralyze us for life, do the most horrible things imaginable to us, and it just starts welling up in the heart right here like, ah! And I remember Tito Ortiz, former UFC champion, giving this interview where he said before every single one of his fights, he would find a room, a quiet place where he could be alone and just cry in order to process this pre-fight anxiety. Because it can be a terrifying thing. A cage fight, probably more so than any other type of fight that I've done. I competed in 5 different combat sports, including MMA, and MMA was by far the most nerve-wracking one, because it's the one where anything could happen. You know, anything could happen in any type of fight, but the psychological changes when you put people in a cage and you lock the door, and it's got this whole mystique of the sport has no rules. Well, it has rules, but that's originally how the UFC was advertised. No rules. It's as real as it gets. And you have the little gloves instead of the bigger padded ones. Even though it's kind of silly, because you can actually punch a lot harder with boxing gloves than you can with the smaller MMA gloves without breaking your hands. If you have the capacity to punch harder in the first place. But there are a bunch of terrifying ideas, imaginary ideas mostly, that go through our minds before a fight. And it's not necessarily the fighter with the best technique, the guy who's the most athletic, that ends up winning. It's often the guy who's able to manage the psychological aspect of this adrenaline dump, who's able to manage this pre-fight anxiety and all these intangible aspects of fighting that we can't train for in the gym. Often, that's the guy, if he's good enough at athleticism, if he's good enough at technique, that psychological aspect can bring him above and beyond the others. Man, I remember Mike Tyson was on Joe Rogan's podcast talking a while back, and he said something along the lines of, he was reminiscing about training, and he talked about guys in the gym who would give him a hard time, guys who could beat him in the gym. And that surprised a lot of people, like, what, Mike Tyson, back then he was indestructible, he was invincible. And he went on to say, no, what I had was the ability to perform in front of a crowd of people with the lights while people are drinking beer and eating popcorn and cheering and booing. I could do that better than they could. You know, he had that intangible psychology about him that allowed him to prevail when other fighters who might have been physiologically superior, who might have been technically superior, would have failed. What are the mental processes after a fight? Yeah, that's where the real mental processes start happening. That's where the real gears start churning. That's where you start processing the damage. That's where you start processing, how is this going to affect my career? How is this going to affect my life? When can I get back in the gym and start training again? When should I get back in the gym and start training again? Was the fight worth it? Did the promoter pay out this time? Because sometimes they don't. There are some bad promoters out there. Am I going to be able to pay the bills? Am I going to be able to eat? Am I going to be able to pay for my training for the next one? Am I going to be able to pay for this trip to the hospital to get my left ear stitched back on? True story, my very first pro kickboxing match. Long before I was an MMA fighter, I was a kickboxer. And my first pro kickboxing match, in round number 1, I got my left ear detached. It was flopping around, bleeding all over the place, hanging by a thread. And the ring doctor comes over between rounds and says, Your ear, it's almost detached. Another punch to that ear, it might come clean off. Do you want to continue? And fighters of my generation, we came up with this idea of never say no, take every fight. Never skip around to sparring. Just be the tough guy, put on the tough facade. And of course I was like, of course I'll continue. And I go out there and I do 2 more rounds and lose the decision. And afterwards have to have my ear stitched back on in the emergency room. And my entire fighter purse goes to the copay at the hospital. And I took a bunch of punches in that fight, that very first fight. And I'm processing all of this in the waiting room of the hospital, just listening to my body saying essentially, why? Why did you do this to me? Why did you allow this to happen? This is a sacred place. What have you done? You got in there with a dude and you let him hit you. Why didn't you hit him back more? And there's all of these regrets. It's a roller coaster of emotion before, during, and after. A friend of mine, very good kickboxer, I remember him saying once that when he fought, he felt like a god. And he knocked a lot of people out. And like that knockout, that moment was amazing. But then after that, the polar opposite. He felt like extreme depression. He felt this extreme depression after he left the venue. Like that night, he'd just be like, none of it matters. That moment of excitement. And then, this huge drop-off of emotion. You go on that big, wild roller coaster of ups and downs, and then, that was his experience. I didn't experience that personally, but he did. And, man, it really got to him. Again, this guy was a great fighter. What kind of pain do you experience? Is that what you said? No. How much does it hurt during and after the fight as well? Well, during a fight, I would be lying if I said you don't feel anything, but you don't feel pain the same way during as you do after. If some dude is on top of you, mounting you, dropping elbows in your face, you're going to feel every one of those. But you're going to process that pain to the full extent afterward. Oh, man. Our buddy Xu Xiaodong, that Chinese fighter who's beaten up all the fake Tai Chi guys, had another fight fairly recently. They set up a fight cage out in the woods somewhere in China, and Xu Xiaodong threw like one push kick, pushed the dude up against the fence, then threw a jab, and not even a hard one, poked the dude in the mouth, and the guy just quits and starts like crying, like, oh, and it's clearly the first time this man had ever been punched in his life. Ever. It's very clear this man has never sparred, not even light contact, not even been poked a little bit in the face. Because as soon as he got pawed, not even a proper stiff jab, but just pawed in the mouth, the man was broken mentally and started to cry. And it's shocking why people who have never even sparred before would think that they would have any right to be in a fight cage, in a cage fight. That's bizarre. But, man, I could see on his face he is processing this in the most visual way. He is processing the pain during the fight, and that's the worst time to process it. It's the worst time to process it. So when you're getting hit, you just have to keep moving or you get hit a lot more. When you're getting hurt, you have to keep fighting to win or you get hurt a lot more. But afterward, again, it's highly variable. I had one fight where I took 0 damage, didn't get punched at all, won by technical submission, one with a TP submission. They marked it down in Sherdog as a triangle choke. A TP is a variation of a triangle choke. Choked this dude, unconscious, didn't take a single punch. And afterwards, I was feeling pretty good. I was like, man, that was great. Because all my other fights, I got punched and kicked and beaten up a little bit. Sometimes a lot. And that one, it was like, whew, I dodged a bullet there. I'm glad that wasn't my first cage fight, man. Because that would have set some very unrealistic expectations about what a cage fight is. I would have thought, man, this is easy. I'm gonna go out there and beat everyone in the world and be UFC champion. But that's the rare exception to take 0 damage. It can happen. It does happen sometimes. There are some one-hit knockouts. There are some quick submissions. But again, that's the rare exception. But that was a huge sigh of relief. That wasn't so much like, yeah, I'm the man. That was more so like, oh, I'm glad that's over. I am glad that's over. Because at that moment, the crazy roller coaster comes to a stop, glides to a stop, and it's like, whew, good. Okay, I'm going to pick up my paycheck and get out of here. Go take a nap or something. I need some rest. But, man, I've had some serious injuries. I broke a foot in my first MMA fight. I won my first MMA fight. My first pro MMA fight. I won it, but I broke my foot. So this dude picks me up, slams me. I try to stop the slam by landing on my foot. Boom, it breaks. I feel that it hurts, but I didn't process how bad it was until after the fight where I couldn't walk anymore. But I get up and I grab him. I catch him in a front headlock, which looks like a guillotine choke. Again, if you look up my fight record, it says I won by guillotine choke. I did not. I won by liver shots while holding him in a front headlock. And he drops to his knees because I'm hitting him really hard with my left shovel hook, boom, boom, repeatedly in the liver. And he drops and I hit him some more. And eventually he taps. And again, it looks like a guillotine choke, so that's what they wrote it down as. Anyway, how did I feel about that one? I was like, woohoo, I won. So for a moment, psychologically, I felt pretty good. And then afterwards, I remember I was like, dang, I need some ibuprofen or something. My foot's swelling up. And so I remember I went with my wife to a Walmart to go buy some ibuprofen, and I realized pretty quickly I couldn't walk. And so I get in the shopping cart, and my wife starts pushing me in the shopping cart in the Walmart. This Walmart worker comes up, and he's like, you can't do that. And I'm like, well, I can't physically walk. My foot's broken. And he gives me this funny look, points to these scooters that the obese people at Walmart generally scoot about on because for whatever reason they can't walk. And so I get in one of these scooters and I start scooting around. People start giving me these dirty looks like, you're not a morbidly obese person. Get out of there, young man. But I get my ibuprofen and I go home, and man, that hurt. That hurt for about 3 months. Just like moving the wrong way in bed caused my foot to be like, ah! I would wake up in pain just from moving around. I broke my skull in my last fight in 2 places. I had a depressed skull fracture right here and a hairline fracture up the cranium, blind spot in one eye. That one didn't hurt nearly as badly as you might think it does. Having your skull smashed, it wasn't painless, but it wasn't the most painful injury I've had. It was the most crippling one, the most catastrophic one, but not the most painful. I had a kickboxing match, not an MMA fight, but a kickboxing match where I had a bunch of my kicks checked. And I didn't think about it at all. I didn't feel it at all, that shin-to-shin contact at all during the fight, because I was just way too high on adrenaline. But afterward, every step I took, it felt like getting hit in the shin with a hammer. And when I went back to the gym a couple months later, because I took some time off, and I kicked the heavy bag, threw a round kick at it, for the first time, I felt like my leg was broken, and I fell on the floor, clutching my shin. Ah! And I went to a doctor, had it x-rayed, and they're like, "You're fine. It's just soft tissue damage." I was like, "Are you sure? Double check those x-rays." And I'm looking them up and down like, yeah, he's right. It's not broken at all. It feels broken, but it's soft tissue damage. So, man, if you want to avoid shin checks, as many as you can. All right. I hope that answers your questions about my experiences with fighting, and hopefully your experiences with fighting will be more positive ones. Thanks for watching. Now get out there and train.